Kurt Gatzow, Deputy of the Grand Master in District 10, has been a kind of a partner in kind of bringing people to come to these various different Zoom meetings. And when he told me about Worship Brother Jamie, I said, yeah, let's do this. Since first grade, I have been fascinated by Greek, by Greek, and yes, to a similar degree, Roman mythology. You know, a lot of you all have already read the description that was put out in the promo. So I'm not going to go in. I'm not going to waste a whole lot. I'm not going to waste any time going into that, quite frankly. So I'm going to turn it over to our speaker tonight, Worship Brother Jamie Lamb. Jamie, the floor is yours, sir.
Thanks, most worshipful, past most worshipful, sitting most worshipful, worshipful brethren, brethren all. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Let me ask, is District 13 the east side of which side of the Cascades are you guys on? The west side?
We're on the west side.
Oh, okay, great. So yeah, you mentioned, I'm a little familiar with the state. I've been through it a few times. A beautiful state. Hopefully you guys are okay with the fires and everything. And I know that's been a difficult time. I'm going to share screen right now. And everybody seeing what I'm seeing? How's that?
Great. Oh, fantastic. You hit F5. I love it.
Okay. There we go. And let me just minimize this. Set this out of the way. Looks like we're all set up. Okay, so Freemasonry and Greek mythology. The reason why it's Greek mythology, normally I would do Greco-Roman or, you know, classical mythology or something like that, and kind of everything from, because I like to study, you know, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, of course, Hellenistic, Greek, Roman mythology. But the reason why this one is Greek mythology is because when I composed it, it was for worshipful John Zavidas in the other Washington, D.C. He was a worshipful man, obviously Greek, his last name, John Zavidas. And his education program during his year was, he wanted it to be all Hellenistic, sort of Greek-centric. So I composed this one for him, and I kind of left out some of the Romanisms, but you know what? We're in mixed company now, so I'm going to bring some of those back in, at least in my commentary on the slides. So Greek mythology or classical mythology, particularly Greco-Roman, is present everywhere in Western culture. We have it in our architecture, it's in all of our literature. Allusions to it are in the cinema, the theater, it's in our words that we use. I mean, when you think of words like fury, or someone's in a panic, or this or that is erotic, even words like music and atlas, chronological, chronos, pandemonium, the word serial for series. Somebody's mic is still on. Sorry, it's just I know some people can't hear when the mics are on. It gets distracting. But anyway, so these illusions are everywhere, and they're unavoidable in Western culture. So that also kind of has the flip side, where the more conversant we are with these allusions to classical mythology, the more references we're likely to catch, you know. So when we watch a film and they're obviously riffing on some mythological narrative, like some, you know, maybe a sequence of the Iliad being allegorized or mythologized in a new setting, you know, the more familiar we are with these characters, these personas, and these narratives, the more we get out of Western culture, frankly, and particularly things like, you know, literature, the cinema, etc. So with that in mind, the focus of this presentation is to sort of take that lens of classical mythology and to point it at Freemasonry and see how these things are represented in the craft, or how we could look at some of the symbolism, ritualism, the allegories and the motifs that we find in and around the lodge room and in and around Masonry and its literature, and how we can find some of these maybe not so conspicuous mythological motifs. So let me make my cursor a pointer, laser pointer. How about that? So there's no better place to start in Freemasonry than the ANNO LUCIS. The ANNO LUCIS, hard C because it's Latin. The ANNO LUCIS, or Year of Light, is you've all seen it. It's on pretty much every cornerstone that Masons have laid. It's in Masonic documentation. It's pretty much everywhere. If you've been around Masonry long enough, you've seen the ANNO LUCIS, you've heard about the ANNO LUCIS, you essentially know what it means. And you probably know that you just add 4,000 years to the current date, the current CE or AD. You add 4,000 years to that and you've arrived at the ANNO LUCIS. But what does that mean? So is it just the date of creation? Why is it different than the Masoretic text creation? Well, if you've looked at my first book, Myth, Magic, and Masonry, the cover of which has a minotaur on it and a zodiacal wheel, I kind of, my thesis in that book is that the ANNO LUCIS is the vantage point from which we should survey the symbolism of the craft, because it affords us a unique perspective in many ways. Without getting too much into that, I will say that it's 6,020 years ago, right? And it's at a time when the vernal equinox, so that is the spring equinox, occurred in the zodiacal sign of Taurus. So when the sun rose on March 20th or 21st, whatever, in the east, on the eastern horizon, 6,000 years ago during the ANNO LUCIS, when it rose at that time, it was rising heliacally with in the sign of Taurus, whereas now it's in the sign of it's late degrees of Pisces right now. So it's moved quite a bit. That's an equinoctial point moves. It's something like a degree every 72 years. All the way through a complete sign of the zodiac, which is 30 degrees every 2,160 years. So you see that we've made some movement on that equinoctial point. So using that 6,000 year ago ANNO LUCIS as our vantage point really kind of shows us some mythology, so sheds some light on the mythology surrounding the craft as well. And what I mean is, well, let's look at some things around that time. Minoan culture is a Taurian age culture. So during that period, when the sun rose at the vernal equinox in Taurus, we find King Minos and Pasiphae, right, his wife. And Zeus had sent a bull. She copulated with the bull, ended up giving birth to the Minotaur. Maybe you know the story, maybe you don't. King Minos was very sort of ashamed of this. They were in Knossos on Crete, the island of Crete in the Mediterranean, where we see frescoes still at that island of bull leaping, they called this. So they were very much what anthropologists would call a cattle cult. You know, they were definitely into bovine symbolism or Taurian symbolism, right? And so back to our story with Minos, he was ashamed that Pasiphae had given birth to this half bull, half man offspring. So he hid the Minotaur in this labyrinth designed by Daedalus. Daedalus is the same guy who made the wax wings for his son Icarus and himself to fly, and they melted, and that's the same Daedalus. So Daedalus designed also this labyrinth, an impenetrable maze in the center of which was the Minotaur, who could not get out. Theseus from the mainland heard about this because there were sacrifices to the Minotaur to placate him or to propitiate this Minotaur, this bloodthirsty abomination in the labyrinth. So Theseus came from the mainland, and in what looked at first as a sacrificial move, oh, I will give myself up in one of the sacrificial offerings. So he made his way into the labyrinth with the help of the thread of Ariadne, because it's, you know, a labyrinth, hard to find your way in, hard to find your way out. So he wound a thread through there. And Ariadne, who was Minos's, I believe she was Minos's daughter, gave him the thread, and he was able to go in there, slay the Minotaur, and eventually find his way out. So that's Theseus and Ariadne during the Taurian age. Obvious Taurian symbolism with the bull and the bull leaping and Knossos, and having to do with this period 6,000 years that commenced 6,000 years ago and is commemorated by our ANNO LUCIS on the cornerstones in our documentation. So in other early stories of Taurian or bovine Taurian age symbolism in Greek mythology and classical mythology, there are, this is called the rape of Europa. So she was, Zeus had disguised himself as a bull and took Europa, and, you know, this would have occurred during that time in the mythological timeline as well, during that Taurian age. Also, there's the tale of Zeus and Io, or Io. I-O. So Zeus, as you may or may not be aware, was sort of a, I guess, a philanderer. So he sort of slept around on Hera, his wife Hera. And he was in the middle of one of these extramarital trysts with a mortal woman named Io, and he saw the approaching peacocks who always preceded Hera when she came onto the scene, and quickly his assistant Mercury, or Hermes at this time, tried to cover up Io, but Zeus had a better idea that was faster. Just change Io into a heifer, or a cow, or well, it has horns here, so a heifer or a cow or a bull. And you see Eros was on the scene as well. So you knew what was happening. So you could see she's pretty suspicious right here. I love this painting. It's very descriptive of the scene as you read about it, and I think Ovid is where you find the main account of that. And interestingly, this is the Mediterranean model of the lodge room. The first appearance I see of this idea is in Mackey, and Albert Mackey wrote he wrote a little bit about this, how it's in his encyclopedia. It's also in the Symbolism of Freemasonry. He didn't get into it too much. It was just a quick allusion to how the ancient world, what we thought of as the ancient world, which they thought of in, you know, in these mythological times, these classical mythological times, as an oblong square. He made the connection that in the West, there are the two pillars, just as there are the pillars of Heracles, you would say, in Greek, and Hercules in Latin. So these pillars of Heracles, one at Jebel Musa in Morocco, and the other at the Rock of Gibraltar. And they're pillars in the west, and then at the heart of the, let's say this is a temple, at the heart in the Mediterranean is the altar. And where else would that altar be? You know, specifically pertaining to Freemasonry, but at Crete, the home of the Minoan culture, the home of this Taurian age culture, at Knossos. And I thought that was a pretty astute observation on his part to make the altar coincide with the ANNO LUCIS. And I'm not sure if he intended that, but there's also, if you think about the directionality, you know, or the cardinality of this Mediterranean model of the lodge room, you could make other connections in terms of the place of darkness, Northern Europe. We call the north the place of darkness. In the east here, you have both what is now Lebanon and Palestine, Israel, all along here, which anciently would be Phoenicia, where Tyre was, right? Tyre and Sidon and Baalbek, etc. Specifically for our purposes, Tyre. That there would be the Tyrian, the home of the Tyrian workmen here, and then the Holy Land, Temple Mount, Solomon's Temple. Both of those sort of in the east, commingling there. And in the south, you could say, is this would be about where Egypt is in terms of North Africa. So if you put that in the south, and then you think of, I think we're all, are we all master masons here? I should have asked that in the beginning. Or do we have some fellow crafts or entered apprentices? I mean, not that it matters. I'll keep it tiled 100% anyway. But if you think about the South and the junior warden in the second part of the third degree, if you think about the junior warden in the South, how that may pertain to certain Egyptian myths, which I guess I'm not going to press any further than that, but the inquiring minds will look into that on their own. So there's just a lot here in this Mediterranean model regarding mythological motifs in the Blue Lodge work. Also, the brazen pillars, which we just talked about, you know, which can be viewed from this perspective as the pillars of Heracles, pillars of Hercules. But also, they do have LILYWORK, network, and pomegranates, as we're told in the lecture, which are two items, specifically the LILYWORK and the pomegranates, that figure pretty prominently in classical mythology. Like here is the story of Zeus had, through an extramarital affair, had produced a child with a mortal, and that child is Heracles. And he for some reason needed Hera to suckle Heracles, or to breastfeed Heracles. So he somehow, I think he gave her, maybe this is opium, but he made her sleep, opium or lotus or something like that, to make her sleep. And then he put Heracles at her breast. She woke up abruptly, was very upset about this, and the drops of spilt milk are said to be where the first lilies were to spring up. So that is the myth of the origin of lilies, is from Heracles suckling the breast of Hera. Here's another one regarding pomegranates, probably the second most significant pomegranate-based myth, and that is Adonis. At the death of Adonis, his spilled blood into the soil are the spots where the first pomegranate trees were said to have sprouted. and the one probably everybody is familiar with is this scene, which is classically known as the rape of Persephone. The rape of Persephone, and they didn't mean rape in the way we commonly or colloquially sort of use it today. They meant it as in an abduction, a forcible abduction, I guess is one way you could put it. Anyway, so Hades, or Pluto, came up out of the ground through a fissure in the ground while Persephone and some other forest nymphs or naiads or whichever they were out gathering flowers, and he came up through this fissure in his chariot and snatched Persephone away. Her mother, Demeter, a grain goddess who we'll meet again here soon, was distraught and looked all over the land for her missing daughter, Persephone, who was in the underworld with Pluto or Hades. And she couldn't find her, and she was so distraught that she let her duties of agriculture and the seasonal growth of plants slide. She just let them go because she was despondent. Finally, the people, there was a famine, and the people talked to Zeus, and they were like, look, you need to do something. You need to talk to Demeter so she takes up her duties again so we can have agriculture. And Zeus had to go make a deal with his brother Hades, Pluto. He had to make a deal so Persephone can come back up, and Demeter, Persephone's mother, would get back to her agricultural duties with the grain. So, but sadly, I guess for Demeter, and maybe for Persephone as well, as she was making her ascent, or about to make her ascent back up to the surface from the underworld, Pluto, Hades, offered her, in some accounts 6 or a dozen or 3, accounts vary, but a number of pomegranate seeds. And she ate them, which means she shouldn't have eaten them, because that means that she had to then spend half of the year in Hades as Pluto's wife, queen of the underworld. So that's why Persephone goes down into the underworld for half of the year. Demeter neglects her duties, and thereby we have the winter months where agriculture is impossible in the region. So this is their sort of mythologization of the agricultural cycle, and it has to do with pomegranates, and the pomegranates figure prominently in as does the LILYWORK, in our pillars. So just another way to kind of look at the pillars and think, it sort of enriches our understanding. That's what all this is. We're just trying to enrich our understanding of some of these motifs in and around Freemasonry. 3 principal supports of the lodge are also the Greek orders of architecture, without the 2 added Roman, the Tuscan and the composite. So these are the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. Now these have, according to Vitruvius, these are used in certain contexts. There are certain contexts in which you would use a Doric, an Ionic, or a Corinthian order in your building, and you would use those in. He describes the Doric as being strong, like a virile young man, and he applies them to structures having to do with Mars Ultor. I believe the temple of Mars Ultor is in the Doric style, and you'll see a propensity to use this Doric style in structures that are have to do with the military, or are otherwise warlike, or placating Mars as a deity, temples devoted to Mars. The Ionic column, or the Ionian order, is sacred to Athena, and is used in houses of learning, used in the academy, used in libraries and all sorts of educational environments, because she is the goddess of wisdom. And the Corinthian order here, which Callimachus is said to have come up with this Corinthian order, and the way that he found it, it's kind of a neat story. He saw a young virgin had just died tragically at a young age, and there was a votive basket laid out near her gravesite. And over time, the acanthus leaves had grown through the weaving of the votive basket, and there was a flat slate set on top of it, and Callimachus noticed how the acanthus leaves were sort of curling from under this slate and weaving their ways through the votive basket, and thus it is said he was hit with the inspiration to go home and sort of compose, or go to his workshop and compose the prototype for the Corinthian order, the Corinthian capital, which would become the sort of impetus, or for the rest of that style. Now, and that is to Aphrodite, of course. Who else? The goddess of beauty. So Vitruvius says that these three orders correspond to Mars, Athena, and Aphrodite in their applications. But also, did you notice, we did say the three principal supports. Did you notice that it is strength, wisdom, and beauty? So strength, wisdom, and beauty, or wisdom, strength, and beauty, whatever order you like. But I think that's pretty demonstrable that is in that symbolism is, in our work. And it's something that, I don't know about you, but I've blown that off before and didn't think much of it until I researched it and found that there actually is a pretty solid mythological basis to our usage of that. All right, let's see. Okay, three principal stages of human life. You remember they talk about this in the course of 3 steps on the winding staircase in one of our lectures. And it's of course youth, manhood, and old age. It reminded me of, when I was researching for this, it reminded me instantly of a story that you hear in Sophocles, one of the Theban plays, they call it. And that is the trilogy involving Oedipus Rex. And Oedipus arrives at Thebes because he is fleeing the city where he was previously living because of a prophetic curse that we don't need to go into. But he was fleeing that city, and he wound up at Thebes. And at the gate of Thebes, there was the dreaded, bloodthirsty Sphinx. And the Sphinx asked her dreaded riddle to all who would pass into the city, and it was, let's see if I could remember it now. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening? She asked. And Oedipus, without skipping a beat, said, it is man. For as a child, he crawls on all 4s. In his manhood, he walks on 2 legs, and in his old age, he uses a cane. Thus, 3. He walks on 3 legs, essentially. And at that point, the Sphinx threw herself off of her perch down into a chasm and died. So, and consequently, Oedipus was then allowed to enter Thebes and become its king, which, if you know the rest of the story, was a dubious honor. He probably would have been better off just not answering the riddle correctly. let's talk about the plumb, the level, and the square. First, the square. This is kind of a no-brainer thing. If you think of our G, I mean, this is just something I threw in. If you think about the G, it is a letter gamma, and a gamma is a square. So it's sort of central, you know, the G for geometry, the G for gamma, and how it is a square. The level I thought was pretty interesting in that there's the Latin libella, and it is in fact related to Libra as well, the zodiacal constellation Libra. And etymologically, these things are all related. But this level as a working tool, of course, it is a balance, you know. And it made me think of, as I was, you know, applying the mythological lens to this, I thought to myself, okay, this relates to Themis, the idea of, in Egyptian mythology, you would say Ma'at, the scale of Ma'at in the Duat in the underworld. But this is in Greco-Roman mythology, there is Themis, she was called, and she held the scales. She was Justitia or justice, and she held these scales, which are the balance, which are the level. Oh, and the plumb. The plumb is interesting because now maybe you're thinking, how does he relate Saturn with the plumb? And here's how I do that. Saturn is associated with lead, Cronus, lead. And lead is, you ever notice on the periodic table, lead is PB. You ever think to yourself, where are they getting PB from for lead? I would think LD, maybe, LD. But they're getting it from plumbum. Plumbum, like from a plumb bob, you put a piece of lead at the end of a string, and it points directly towards the, you know, I guess the center of the earth, or the gravitational center of the earth, if that's a different thing than the very center. But plumbum is lead, PB, and lead is classically associated with Kronos, and not only classically and mythologically, but also through the, also planetarily and astrologically, but also alchemically. So there's a process, you know, turning base metals into gold, etc., and lead figures prominently in that process. And the figure that is sometimes used is the planetary glyph for Saturn. So there goes. Okay, and let's see. Let's talk about the, how much time I got? Oh, we got a little time. Okay, so I wanted to leave some time for Q&A because, so do, if you have any questions, we should have a few minutes left for that at the end. Just a few more slides here. Lodge officers as mythological archetypes. So I want to go through some of the lodge officers' roles and see how these size up to some mythological archetypes that we're familiar with. Like for instance, one of my first, I was in my Blue Lodge back in Connecticut. I had to immediately get in line. We were a pretty small lodge, and I had to immediately get in line after I was raised, and I became senior deacon first year. So back east, you have to learn the middle chamber lecture, they call it, the fellowcraft lecture, as a senior deacon. So you conduct the candidate, you receive and conduct, etc. And part of the job of the conductor mythologically falls under these hermetic or mercurial. Hermes, Mercury, they're the same. He is the psychopomp. He is the guide of souls into the underworld. So without getting into too much detail, I'd invite you to think about the senior deacon's role in the second half of the third degree and this guiding of souls into the underworld, let's say, or if you were to, by underworld, you could mean anything from Hades to, let's say, the low part of a clock, like low 12 or something like that. So there's you know, there's this hermetic messenger, this guide of souls, which the senior deacon partakes of these archetypal roles. There's also the scribe, also a mercurial sort of really Thothic, or actually an Egyptian told me that is, you've probably seen it pronounced, or you've seen it written Thoth for Thoth. You would say Thoth a la Manly P. Hall. If you've listened to his lectures, he says Thoth. A lot of people would say Thoth. My wife and I were in Egypt some years ago, and I was told that the pronunciation was Tahut, like Tahuti or Tahuti. So Tahut, Tahat is how they would have pronounced it. Not that I'm hung up on any particular. People know what you mean when you say Thoth, you know, but I try and bring that up whenever I can. It's technically Tahat. Anyway, he was the scribe of the gods. You see him with his stylus and papyrus, or sometimes a stylus and there's even Nabu. I think his name was Nabu in the Babylonian pantheon or the Mesopotamian pantheon. It might have been Akkadian or Sumerian, but he was called Nabu, was the mercurial archetype, and he was also a scribe, and he had the stylus and the cuneiform tablet. In Egypt, Tahuti or Thoth has the stylus and the papyrus. Mercury, the scribe, and our scribes have the parchment and the quill and parchment of the historian of the lodge, and of course, to a lesser extent, the crossed quills of the secretary. These being what you would call syncretized hermetic archetypes. So syncretized meaning we're talking about Thoth, we're talking about Nabu, we're talking about Mercury, we're talking about Hermes, as an extension of one archetype, you know, as a sort of varied expression of that hermetic mercurial archetype across a few different civilizations, but subsumed by later civilizations. And you could say subsumed in Freemasonry, because we've taken this archetypal role, except now we call it the historian in the case of this jewel, or the secretary in the case of more scribal sort of roles. Okay, lodge officers as mythological archetypes. Okay, this is Phoebus Apollo, and if you know the story of Phaethon, I think it was Phaethon. I will have to consult my notes real quick. Phaethon. So Phaethon was the son, half mortal son of Phoebus Apollo, and when he found out that was his birth father, he told his mother, "I must go see him." You know, because none of the people, I think it was a situation in almost like a Brady Bunch episode where he was at school and the kids didn't believe that Phoebus Apollo was his dad. So he had to go visit Phoebus Apollo and somehow get proof to take it back to school. I know that there's a Brady Bunch episode that's something very similar. Anyway, so he had to see. There's another example of classical mythology showing up in pop culture, because now when you watch, you know, well, let's say the Brady Bunch, you see that these these mythological motifs kind of just wind up in funny places. Oh, it's like a buddy of mine and I were talking about The Breakfast Club. You ever see the John Hughes film, 80s high school film called The Breakfast Club? And I'm way into astrology, as is a couple of my friends, and we were talking about these astrological archetypes in the Breakfast Club, who are mythological archetypes. So like Ali Sheedy is the lunar sort of Hecate type character or archetype, and Emilio Estevez is this sort of martial kind of sporty guy, etc. Anyway, so again, Phaeton meets his father, Phoebus Apollo, and Phoebus Apollo is like, so great to see you. You can have any wish you want right now. Name one thing and I'll let you have it. He says, I want to fly, I want to ride your chariot, your solar chariot that makes a trip, the diurnal transit from east to west across the sky. It's the sun, as the sun rises in the east, culminates in the south, and sets in the west. So does Phoebus Apollo's chariot in classical mythology make this same transit from east to west. Anyway, Phaeton ends up, I don't know if you know the story, he can't control the steeds that sort of power this chariot, and he ends up in big trouble. Zeus ends up having to send a lightning bolt and just blasts him out of the sky. He was left optionless because he was making a real mess. Okay. Oh, here's another one about the marshal. So this is the sacking of Troy. This is the end of Troy. If anybody who's read the Iliad, you know that there's an exceedingly long passage at the end where they do what's called a triumphy, a triumph or a procession, where they parade the spoils of war around the fallen city of Troy, and this is in fact the route of our carousel. When you ride on a carousel, the horses going in a circle owe themselves to the victory procession, which is a classical mythological, well, not only mythological, it's an anthropological motif or mechanism. This is something we know happened, not necessarily at Troy, or Ilium, but anyway. So who leads processions for the Freemasons? The marshal does. So the marshal with his baton leads these processions, and these are triumphes. And the first one that I know of is the one we read about in Homer, where this victory procession after the sacking of Troy. It's interesting, if you look into the carousel and the triumphy, you think of the trump cards of the tarot, which are directly related to a victory lap, a triumph. So I've got lots of talks on the tarot, but if you look into the tarot stuff, there's really only the 4 suits like playing cards, and then affixed to them are 22 triumph or trump cards, and they're related to this very same concept, and it's mythological. Here's another one. So the cornucopia, which you see on the steward's rods. In classical mythology, there was Amalthea, the she-goat that suckled Zeus, and there was Demeter also had a cornucopia, and it's related cornucopia because Amalthea, just like Capricorn, a goat, Cornus, Capricornus, that's related to the cornucopia, the horn of plenty. There's also something called the thyrsus. The thyrsus, that's this pine cone thing. In Mackey, you'll read, quote, the tops of points of the Masonic rods of deacons are often surmounted by a pine cone or pine apple. That's Albert Mackey said that. I think it was in the Symbolism of Masonry, and I'm sure it's in his encyclopedia as well. The tops of, so though you don't see a lot of this now, I have seen examples of this. The deacon's rods being topped with a pine cone like motif, and the pine cone is actually was a more popular Masonic symbol in the past. It's kind of lost its popularity over the last maybe, I don't know, 100 years, or since after the world wars of the 20th century. You don't see that much of it anymore, but it was more prominent before that. My lodge that we chartered here in Phoenix, Arizona, that's our symbol. It's on our stamp and everything. So we're trying to sort of resuscitate this symbol and its Masonic context. But this is the thyrsus. It has to do with Dionysus and the rites of Dionysus, and it was once very popular in terms of its usage in Masonic symbolism. Another one is the crossed keys of the treasurer. So you see the treasurer's jewel here, very much like the crossed keys of Hecate, goddess of the crossroads. Now it's funny that it would be the crossed keys of the treasurer, and she's the goddess of the crossroads, and that is also her symbol. But she, like the treasurer, is also in charge of currency, coinage, and silver. So it's sort of her domain, this sort of financial, this keeping of finances and this locking away of a treasury and these crossed keys. So when next time you see your treasurer, you know, think maybe, what does that have to do with Hecate, the goddess Hecate of the crossroads? Here's one of my favorites. I was a lodge organist for some years before I got pulled back in line a couple of years ago. But not, you know, and I'm glad about that. And it's I love to do it, but I really loved just sitting there playing the organ. I loved accompanying ritual, and I dare I say I was pretty good at it, and perhaps the best organist I've ever. No, I'm kidding. I'm very humble about my organing, I guess. Anyway, so the jewel of the organist comes from the is the lyre, is what you call this, and the lyre is very prevalent as a mythological symbol regarding the Orphic mysteries and the persona of Orpheus himself. Orpheus was given the lyre by Apollo. And he used it to charm both man and beast. He could charm his way into Hades and back. One of the few that made it down into Hades to rescue Eurydice, his ill-fated bride who got bit by a snake, I think on their wedding night. And he had to go down to Hades. He had an opportunity to bring her back, but he blew it at the very end. I won't get into the whole tale, but he was ever accompanied by this lyre, the Orphic lyre, which plays heavily in a certain mystery tradition as well, and I like to think is very prominent and important in Masonic ritual and the symbolism of Freemasonry. All right, I'm going to blow this one off, but this is Hephaestus. He is, well, I'll go through it real quick. This is Hephaestus. He's a worker in metals. He is also Vulcan in the Latin. In the sort of Judaic pantheon, he was a blacksmith, like Tubal-Cain is a blacksmith. So he is a blacksmith. Tubal-Cain was a blacksmith in the Judaic thing. Vulcan was the blacksmith in the Roman or Latin pantheon, and Hephaestus is the archetype of this blacksmith in the Hellenistic or Greek pantheon of gods, classical mythological pantheon. This is Cybele, sort of a Anatolian grain goddess. I'm not going to get into that one. Okay. So, chthonic descents. By this, I mean descents into the underworld. In a lot of you'll see a lot of solar allegories in mythology, like Zeus and like Hercules and the 12 labors of Hercules, right? Which can be read as being a solar allegory of the sun through the 12 signs of the zodiac. As can a certain aspect of Masonic ritual that I won't mention right now. So this slide, I guess, I'm going to have to leave to your imagination how this descent into the underworld and its sort of astrological symbolism, like the cave of the nymphs shown here. This is actually, if you want to know more about this one, buy my first book, which is Myth, Magic, and Masonry, because I spell this one out in there completely. And then, yeah, see, this is about Hercules, and the first he goes through his 12 labors, like this one where he is slaying the Cretan bull, or wrestling the Cretan bull. Cretan as in from Crete, and a bull as in, you know how fond they were of bulls because of the ANNO LUCIS. They were a Taurian age cattle cult on the island of Crete in the middle of the Mediterranean during the period of the ANNO LUCIS. And Hercules, as the sun, is slaying this bull. So this is to say the sun in the house of Taurus, in the sign of Taurus at the vernal equinox, much like the Mithraic tauroctony, if you're familiar with that. I get into that in my first book as well. Oh, and then here he is slaying the Nemean lion. So if you're thinking this is the sun in Taurus, what do you think is going on here? This is the sun in Leo, obviously. And the other ones sort of correspond, not as blatantly as these two, but the other 12 labors also correspond to a zodiacal transit, I guess, an annual transit of the sun through the signs of the zodiac. This one we already talked about. That's Orpheus, who went down to, he did a chthonic descent into the underworld to rescue Eurydice. This I won't get into, but I will say, here's one thing I did want to regarding this. There, you'll sometimes hear the word tragedy. A tragedy is thrown around, and a tragedy, if you break down the word, it means tragos ode. Tragos is like a he-goat, a tragos, and ode means song in ancient Greek. So when you say a tragedy or a tragos ode, you're talking about a goat song. So a goat song were hymns to Pan. They were Dionysian, they accompanied the Dionysian rites, these hymns to Pan, these goat songs. This is the precursor to our theater. Our tragic theater comes from Greco-Roman mystery traditions, particularly classical Greek, pre-Hellenistic mystery traditions like the Dionysian mysteries. And if you read DaCosta and Mackey, they make a whole lot about the transmission of these Dionysian tragic rites, tragos, ode, goat songs, and how these tragedies found their way into some of the work of Masonry, tragic theater, and into the cinema, etc. So, in summary, I would like to say this. I would like to say that it is my belief, and hopefully yours now, that a basic understanding of these mythological archetypes and these narratives and some of these personas and some of these motifs really helps to enrich our experience, not only of Masonry, as we've pointed out. We've kind of focused ourselves on the work, the symbolism, and the narratives and allegories around Freemasonry, not only of Masonry, but also of all literature, all films, all, TV shows like The Brady Bunch and movies like The Breakfast Club. As mundane and sort of superficial as those things sound, if you have an understanding of classical mythology, that is to say, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, pre-Hellenistic Greek, Minoan, Hellenistic Greek, Latin, Roman, etc. If you have an understanding of these myths and these people and narratives, it enriches your experience the world and of its products, like the arts and things like that. Like, and even something as simple as the days of the week. Look at the days of the week. Monday, day of the moon, Luna. It's called lunes in Spanish. Tuesday, which is Thursday, Tyr, which is the Norse or Germanic version of Mars, and that's why they call it Martes in Spanish. Dies in Latin, it's Dies Martis, Dies Martis, I think it's called, Day of Mars. You can go on and on. The 7 days of the week are mythological characters. That's how they get their name, and they're also the 7 visible planets. These things are all inextricably sort of wound up in a system that we can penetrate by learning a little bit about classical mythology and applying it. Even language, like we talked about, one of the first things we talked about in this discussion, fury, panic, erotic, music, atlas, chronology, etc., serial, all of these words, all of these days of the week, it really behooves us to get a handle on this stuff, and hopefully I've left some time for Q&A. It's 8 on the dot right now. Most worshipful and brethren, thank you so much for your time and your attention. And I'm going to escape out of here. Stop share.
Well, thank you, Jamie. That was indeed thought provoking. You know, you always look at you go through life, you're looking at things and you're going, I wonder why, you all say, okay, I wonder why he built it that way, or why he exists that way. And then for that matter, why did certain things work their way into our Masonic teachings as they had? Bill Clark, where are you? Bill, I know you're here. At least I thought you were here. If you would be so kind to unmute yourself so I can find you. Oh, well, there you are, but you got to unmute. Bill?
I see his question. Wasn't Hecate also a representative of fertility?
Yeah.
Bill Clark asks. And that, I don't know. I know of her in her sort of 3-faced witchy mode. Here's what I know about Hecate. She was the goddess of the crossroads. Yes. So here's her fertility aspect. It's coming back to me. So she was a lunar goddess. Because she was lunar, she represented the crone aspect. So not fertility, actually, but the antithesis of that, barrenness. So there was the waxing crescent, the full moon, and the waning crescent. You'll sometimes see it. It's been co-opted by a lot of pagan and Wiccan organizations now. It's a waxing crescent, a full moon, and a waning crescent, and it's a symbol that was associated with Hecate because she was 3-faced, and in these 3 modes of her archetypal expression, there was the maiden, the mother, and the crone, and sometimes they were distributed among 3 goddesses, which I think were Artemis, Demeter, and Hecate. Yeah. So Artemis, Demeter, and Hecate. So that's the closest I know of. That's a pretty direct association with the fertility cycle, at least.
Okay, thank you. I kind of had heard that before, but I wasn't sure how it fit in. That's why I asked the question.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
Tom Bond, I saw that you unmuted your mic. Have you got anything?
Well, I just got an update on Wayne Deming.
Oh, please share.
I just got done with the rainbow meeting, so I had to come this. But Wayne is doing okay. He's not eating as well as he should. And we've got some of the brethren are going to go by tomorrow and Wednesday he's getting meals, but he's not eating them. And we're not sure what the problem is. He's still got his mind as active as ever. He wants to come back to lodge. He wants to engage people, but we're just worried about his physical now. So But we're going to check on him tomorrow, and we'll know. We'll put it out Friday night. Or we'll know more. If anything's wrong, everybody will know about it.
Thank you, Tom.
You
For
bet.
those of you who don't know, Wayne Deming is our most senior past Grandmaster, served in 1970-71. Do the math. He's 102 now, is he not?
He is.
So every extra day that we get with him is a blessing indeed.
It is.
So I just want to find out if there are any more questions here. I just want to kind of go through. Chris, our Grandmaster, yes.
I was just going to ask Tom to send my personal regards to Wayne when you see him.
I shall.
Thank you.
You bet.
So Jamie, you answered a lot of my questions as you were going through all the various different officers and the allegories primarily of the symbol of the jewel that they wear. Because I do a lot of installations, so I put a jewel on a guy and it's like, okay, yeah, I can explain it, but I'm sure there's something behind it. So thank you for giving that to me. I appreciate that very, very much. Because sometimes we do stuff because of rote, and sometimes we do stuff out of a level of understanding, and when we can do both, that's even better. So thank you for that. Richard Reddick, I see your hand up.
Noticed in one of the pictures of Apollo, he was sitting on kind of a throne above 3 steps, and made me think of a certain person in the East in the lodge. Wondering if you could comment upon that.
Yeah, I think I didn't notice that in that picture, but I think having him as, having these 3 steps for the dais officers or the pedestal officers, I think is important. It's also in keeping with a Vitruvian model of an uneven number of steps, which makes it so you're alighting with the proper foot, or it's the different foot than you stepped off with. So let me see, 1, 2, 3. So yeah, if you begin with your right foot, you will end on sure footing. Vitruvius wrote about that in De Architectura, his I think 10 books on architecture, and he got the idea from a Pythagorean principle about odd numbers of steps. I in fact wrote about that in extensively in my second book, which is entitled Approaching the Middle Chamber. So where I take the Fellowcraft lecture and this is like almost a 500-page book that I wrote about a year ago, and I go minutely through the Fellowcraft lecture start to finish, and I go from the porch to the middle chamber and up the staircase, and a lot of this stuff that I had talked about tonight, some of that finds its way in, and the reason and of course this thing about the steps and Vitruvius and Pythagoras finds its way in there, as does a lot of the architectural stuff. And I bring that up because the impetus for writing that book was that when I was passed, I felt like yeah, I had the lecture and the 7 liberal arts and sciences were kind of told to me in 15 minutes, but then we never have to touch them again. I felt like, yeah, we should spend a lot more time on the 7 liberal arts and sciences, because that's the entirety of our curriculum. That's all that we are given as a curriculum, is the 7 liberal arts and sciences. And I'm passionate about it because we just blow past the Fellowcraft degree. We even call it passed. Oh, I passed that. As if you just, yeah, you're all excited because you're an EA and you became a Mason, and then you just want to rush to the Master Mason degree and, blur past the Fellowcraft degree, when the Fellowcraft degree contains the entirety of our curriculum. So I felt like that was a travesty. There was a huge vacuum in our literature. Masonic literature is extremely anemic in terms of the 7 liberal arts and sciences in any detail and any depth. And I felt like it was time that there's a book where in one place you kind of go through the 7 liberal arts and go through that Fellowcraft lecture and give it the treatment that it deserves. I know I kind of went off there, but I'm passionate about that particular thing.
That's okay. By the way, I've put links to the 2 books that that Worship Brother Jamie has brought up. So if you want to either click on those or copy paste, those links are there. So Lauren White, I've got Lauren White, and then I got Patrick Webb. So Lauren, you go ahead and go first.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks for that talk, Brother Jamie, and I totally agree with everything that you were saying. My question is, how did our medieval and Renaissance and Enlightenment brethren engage with Greek mythological frameworks? Like, what was the historical context for how they in Europe were learning about all these Greek myths and incorporating them into their work life and everything like that? If you're familiar with that, I was just curious.
So I think they had them in their syncretized or subsumed form, and by that I mean the guilds, the craft guilds, were given by the church a passion play to perform. So each, like the Bakers Guild, were given the feeding of the 5,000. The carpenters were given the builders of Noah's Ark, the building of Noah's Ark, the raising of Lazarus, the passion of the Christ, the building of King Solomon's temple, etc. These sequences from Scripture were bestowed upon the craft guilds for them to perform what was known as a mystery play or a passion play. And as these passion plays were distributed, they were distributed trade specific, I guess you could say, or craft specific. Like we were talking about, the bakers given the feeding of the 5,000, etc. So you can imagine that a building narrative would fit nicely with the stonemasons, right? The medieval stonemasons. So to have these sort of I guess to sort of say it frankly, there's a lot of these archetypes that found their way into the Judeo-Christian mythos, right? I'm going to try and be careful about wording this, but one religion's mythology is another religion's canonical scripture. You know what I mean? So what I mean by that is the Hindus, let's say, probably look at Judeo-Christian literature as just myth, a classic in world literature, but it's not their thing. So to them, it's just some mythological cycle, as is the Mahabharata to us. It's just some pagan mythological cycle, a Christian might say, or a Jew might say. Whereas a pagan might say, no, the real book is the Iliad and the Odyssey. You know, these are, and Pindar and Ovid, etc. So it's a matter of your frame of reference, how these things are syncretized, and how they were, in our case, going back to the medieval stonemasons, the operative masons, and cathedral builders, etc. They were given this thing in a syncretized form, I believe.
Okay. Patrick Webb. Got on mute. Got on mute, Patrick. There you go.
People prefer it when I'm muted, Jamie. I have a bit of a reputation for long-windedness, and also, of course, I don't sound like the other blokes on here. Thank you for your erudite talk. You've been quoted, I'm a journalist, so I got to bring up your words of the past, saying it's all but impossible to say at exactly what developmental stage the commingling of the concepts occurred, and we were talking in that script about world mythology and the initiatory traditions that we sort of developed. I wonder if you might amuse us or humor us with perhaps a little speculation on who was connecting the dots for our English language ritual and when it was happening.
Okay, so if you get into, there's a certain strain of this Dionysian current that that DaCosta and Mackey talk about, which I think is a pretty juicy little tidbit. There's a couple ways to approach it, and here's what I mean by it. So Mackey says that the Dionysian artificers were Phoenician, because Dionysus was based on a Phoenician sort of prototypical god form. And the Dionysian artificers were there at the building of King Solomon's temple. They were Phoenician Tyrian builders. They were there. The Jews took on their mysteries, their Dionysian mysteries, but Mackey says the Jews did not like that they were pagan mysteries, so they substituted more appropriate Judaic archetypes and just plugged in those archetypes. And another kind of interesting thing is that this Dionysian current was woven through the, see if I could remember, the Comacene masters, the Lombard masters, and the Comacini. These are particular building guilds that make it through up into Europe, up into Northern Europe, and up into Northern Italy at Lake Como, the Comacini.
Yeah, Moses Redding's real keen on that link, isn't he?
Yeah, so there's that whole thing, but there's another one that I think is pretty interesting as well, aside from that Mackey DaCosta thing, which is, and this one, actually Mackey talks about this one as well in History of Masonry, I think. But he says how when the Roman legionaries came up building Hadrian's Wall, etc., into Scotland and up into Northumbria or whatever it was at that time. Hadrian's Wall, I've seen pieces of it as far as I was in Newcastle and I saw some of it there, but I think it goes up into Scotland as well. But he says that the Mithraic Roman legionaries, because you know Mithraism was a soldier's cult. It was the cult of the soldiers. So these the Tauroctony and Mithras and this whole sort of post-Zoroastrian mystery tradition made its way into the Roman legionaries, who brought it up with Hadrian's Wall and that campaign up into the British Isles. And that's why you get Oxford, an ox by a water ford, just like a Mithraeum would be built, a Tauroctony by a water ford. And also he says that the Roman legionaries, the Mithraists, had contact with the Scottish Picti, the Picts, Picts. So that's another sort of current that feeds in. Both of these are unsubstantiated, but you asked for some of the more
well, what I'm looking for you to do, obviously your depth of your research is way beyond my intellectual delvings into Masonic traditions, but I guess what I'm looking for is, has your research provided evidence to you that the $64,000 question, are Masons linked with a continuous flow to antiquity, or did Masons at some period in history take what they considered the best of these traditions and create a ritual that we all think is tremendous, but that picked and chose from different traditions, but doesn't necessarily have a direct lineage from antiquity?
So I think that option B, that it was sort of, I don't.
And so my question is, when was that happening?
So probably around, so you see that we start to see speculative masonry or accepted masons around Robert Moray and Ashmole and people like that. So
Yeah.
that's when you start to see Royal Society members, practicing alchemists, Rosicrucians, and people like that starting to come in.
So 1640s, really, around that time.
Yeah, middle of the 17th century, I would say. And that's where you kind of see this blossoming of you know, of our ritual and stuff. And
Thank you.
Yeah. Great question. Thanks for that.
I'm a recovering journalist. I can't stop myself sometimes.
Hey, I wanted to let Lauren know, Lauren White, Brother Lauren.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey, there's a book that I'm reading. It's called The Pillars of the Earth, and it's about masonry, speculative, but it's in the 16th century. You might find it interesting.
I've heard of that book. Thank you. It's definitely in my stack somewhere, along with the Middle Chamber.
Yeah, I mean, I'm into learning more about the Masonic speculative part of our culture. I think that's what I'm trying to say. But yeah, and it's interesting to know how Masons get started and what's all involved in it.
Yeah,
The
let's do
science
it.
of it. Thanks. Just wanted to let you know.
Thank you.
Well, I really appreciate it, brethren. Thanks so much for your attention and your questions, and thanks so much for asking me. Please, next time you see worshipful brother Kurt Gazow, I hope I'm saying his name right, please tell him thank you. He's the one who sort of invited me. Now, I'm sorry, but his name escapes me, but please give my regards to your oldest living past Grand Master. 71 was the year I was born, and if that's the year he was Grand Master, that just kind of blows my mind. That, I mean, 100 and something years old. What a tremendous amount of service. You guys are very blessed to have somebody with that much sort of just, I mean, he must be a font of wisdom for you guys.
I've sat in lodge with Wayne Deming many times, and he is an amazing person. To hear stories from the 30s and stuff like that is a really special thing nowadays.
Yeah, please give him my regards. Just some Mason gives his best.
Jim, you're muted.
How did I get muted? This is my meeting.
No respect.
I'm telling you, it's my meeting. I got muted. Any event, first of all, Jamie, thank you so very much. You know, appreciate your time being with us today. No doubt we've all learned something, and I'm looking forward to see, and hopefully people will take advantage of some of the stuff that you've authored. I put links in the chat, so please go ahead and take advantage of that. You can copy paste them for your reference later, or linking them now, and then do what you want. I noticed that you could buy 3 of his books for $50.87 on Amazon, so that's kind of cool. With that, I always like to turn when he attends our Zoom meetings here at District 13, I always like to give the last word to the Grand Master. Grand Master.
Thank you, most worshipful brother Jim. And Jamie, thank you. That was very enlightening. I enjoyed it immensely. You talked about announcements earlier. This Saturday is the last district meeting that we're going to have before the first of the year. It's District 30. It starts at 2:30. If you want to attend, you can sign up through Grandview. I wrote a couple notes down here. No, we talked about Wayne Deming a couple of times. It's, 50 years ago, he's Grand Master. It's ironic in a way. 50 years ago, I was State Master Counselor. Not here, but, it was just happened to be that worked out that way. Wayne is a great guy, and I hope he is doing well. Get him to eat. He absolutely needs to do that, because I'm looking forward to staying in the lodge with him again. My brothers, this is an excellent attendance. I saw up to 51, 52, I think.
57.
57, thank you. During this, great talk again, Jamie. Thank you. And brother, be safe. Keep yourself well, and I look forward to, as soon as we can, meeting together as brothers on that level. Thank you, Most Worshipful Jim, and thank you all for being here.
Thanks, brethren.